When I go about a character study, the first thing I like to do is I search their names. So if you search Aquila, he comes up 6 times, and they are in Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 2 Timothy. When I search Priscilla, she's the exact same amount of time, 6 times. In fact, Aquila and Priscilla always occur those 6 times together. So right away, when you sort of search the name of the character, you get a sense like, ooh, every time that they're mentioned, Aquila and Priscilla, they are together. So you start to think about different, what that might mean as a husband and wife couple. Now, when you look of Acts 18, what I try and do is once I find out, well, where am I going to go? Where am I going to find these characters once I've searched them? Then I start at the beginning. So the first time they're mentioned is in Acts chapter 18. So if you have Acts 18 open, here's the verse. It says in verse 2, that Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila. He was born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife, Priscilla. So I start right there. I just open up Acts 18 and I just get familiar with what's happening. Now there's 3 things that I really want to accomplish when I open Acts 18. And here they are. I want to try and understand what's the key narration, what are the key words, and what are the key definitions. And that way I have a good grasp of what's happening in Acts chapter 18, okay? So in Acts chapter 18, if you just go back to Acts 17, Paul is on his 2nd missionary journey. And I'm trying to get a sense of how is the journey going for Paul? Because that's going to help me when I sort of come to appreciate why it is that Aquila and Priscilla now come into the life of the Apostle Paul. So in Acts chapter 17, you'll remember that in verse 5, the Apostle Paul, he's gone through Amphipolis and Apollonia. There's no synagogue there, so he presses forward and he comes to Thessalonica, and he has a good response when he preaches there. But in Acts 17 and verse 5, here's what it says. But the Jews which believe not were moved with envy. And they took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, gathered a company, set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. So you have to imagine youth conference. And here's the Apostle Paul. He's got a good response in Thessalonica, but then all of a sudden the whole city is against him. That would be very challenging. So he is thrust out of the city, and he moves on to Berea, and he meets the Bereans. And they're marvelous examples of how, even though an apostle came to their company, they still checked the scriptures to see if everything the Apostle Paul said was true, but it would have been true. But when the apostle goes to Berea, look what it says in verse 13 of Acts 17. But when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea, they came thither also, and they stirred up the people. So you have to just imagine that at this point in the 2nd missionary journey, Paul is being bombarded, and the Jews are pestering him, and they're very antagonistic. And that'd be very difficult. You have to appreciate that if we were preaching, if we had some sort of campaign, like an Operation Monday, for example, we put on a seminar, and we were being pushed around, and people were coming, and they made it impossible for us to actually preach. That might be actually quite, sad, and you'd have to sort of renew your energy. Now, when you move forward in Acts chapter 17, and the Apostle Paul, he goes to Athens. Well, here's what it says in verse 16. It says that, now when Paul waited for them, and this is Timotheus and Silas, to come to him, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. So he goes to Athens. There's no one there, no brothers or sisters that he can commune with. He's on his own. And the whole city is like the pinnacle of what the world offers. Now he's pressed in his spirit, and he gives this amazing sort of discussion on the truth at Mars Hill. But then the end of Acts chapter 17, you see in verse 32, here's sort of the response. And you think about this youth conference. If we had given this triumphant Mars Hill and we sort of preached the truth, and here's the response, verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked. And others said, oh, we'll hear thee again of this matter. So you really appreciate from the Apostle Paul's standpoint, at this point in the missionary journey, is really challenging. And even though in verse 33 and 34, there's some sincere, individuals who turn to Paul and they believe him, etc., you have to sort of balance that the weight of the negativity on the Apostle Paul is quite heavy at this point. And that's just reading. So then when you come to Acts chapter 18, you get a sense of where the Apostle Paul is. And you notice verse 1 of Acts chapter 18. It says, and after these things, Paul departed from Athens, and he came to Corinth. You just imagine that here now is Paul, and he came to Corinth. It doesn't say that he came to brother so-and-so's house. It doesn't say that he came to this ecclesia. He's still on his own. And so when you sort of read what sort of the precursor to Acts 18 is in Aquila and Priscilla, you really think for the Apostle Paul, if we were there, we would feel very challenged. And so he's alone. And to sort of make matters worse, if you look at verse 9 and 10 of Acts 18, there is good cause for the Apostle Paul to be afraid of his life. Because in verse 9 of Acts 18, then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision, be not afraid, and speak. Hold not thy peace, for I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Now you have to ask the question, your conference, why would the Lord say this if Paul did not need it? Because Paul was afraid, and he was worrying if he should stop preaching. In fact, he was probably being threatened. So you have to think, it's at this sort of like portion of the second missionary journey, and we're getting towards the end of the second missionary journey, that there's going to be this couple that comes into Paul's life, and they're going to be absolutely instrumental in helping him. And so when I'm going through a character study, all I've done is I've taken you through what I did. I searched where their names are. I came to Acts 18, and I said, okay, I could jump right into Acts 18, or I could sort of like look on either side and try and see, well, where is Acts 18? And where does it sort of fall? You sort of notice that, if the Apostle Paul is going through Acts 17, he comes to Acts 18, not everything is going well for the Apostle Paul. So it helps us to sort of appreciate God's usage of Aquila and Priscilla. Now, if you have a pencil, I'm going to encourage you to do this. And you can do it in pencil. If you do a color, that's fine. Just make sure you know what color means something to you, but do a pencil. The next thing I do once I got the key narration is I'd like to look at a key word. Keywords are amazing because you just start reading, think, oh, that word's popping up 5, 6, 7, 8 times in the chapter. Well, that's a good sign. It's probably a key word. So one key word that's really stuck out for me in Acts 18 is the word Jew or Jews. Now you might say, oh, Brother Jesse, it's got to be like hundreds and hundreds of Jew and Jews in the Bible. How is that a key word? But why it stuck out for me is when you look at the book of Acts, there's about 40 times that Jew or Jews is mentioned. And 10 times is in Acts 18. Well, if you have 28 chapters in the book of Acts, and you have only 40 times, and a quarter of them are in this one chapter, well, it's a good idea that perhaps this is a key word. So I'll give you an example. So what I do is I have different colors. So I'm not going to confuse you with my colors because you might have different colors. But what I would suggest you do is take your pencil, you give a couple like really confident clicks. You say, that's going to get a 2 click right there. You go like this, and you just circle. So in verse 2, and Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila. And then at the end of verse 2, Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. In verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews. And in verse 5, when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, testified to the Jews. So you get this idea that there's going to be this sort of juxtaposition, okay, with Jews on one side and Gentiles or Greeks on the other side. And just so you know, you can go through later on your own time, you can sort of circle the rest of them in chapter 18. You should come up with 10, Jew or Jews. And why that's significant is because when you look at Aquila and Priscilla, in verse 2, it says that Paul found a certain Jew. So there's no funny business about Aquila. He was a Jew. Now that's interesting because we have to ask ourselves, okay, he's a Jew, but was he in the truth? And you see, I'm going to suggest to you he was not. And the reason why I suggest to you is because the reason why Aquila and Paul came together was not because of the truth. Aquila and Paul came together because they were tent makers. So what happened is perhaps in the market or around the synagogue, the commercialism of what was going on in Corinth, that these two would have, communed together. Oh, you're a tent maker? Oh, I'm a tent maker. Would you like to do some business together? Yeah, sure. Let's do it. And then they get together. So I suggest to you on that. So you might say, oh, maybe he was in the truth before, but just sort of hold that in the thought. But I suggest to you he was not in the truth when they met. Now, if that is true, and Aquila was not in the truth, then he's a Jew, and he's going to have to determine, when I meet the Apostle Paul, who's preaching the truth, will I stay as an old law Jew, or will I cross over to the new covenant? So now there's sort of like a decision, if that's true that Aquila is not in the truth yet. Now, once I've done the key narration, once I've done the key words, which is really just reading. I haven't even touched the books yet, which is so lovely about just sort of, you first want to see, what does God have to say about these characters? It's amazing. All you're doing is just reading. And I love that, because all these books back here, I'll touch on them in a second, but you don't need them yet. So none of us can say, well, I don't have books. Well, you got the best book, right? So you just sort of, once I got the key narration, I got the key words, then I use my lexicons, like Brown Driver Briggs for the Old Testament, or Thayer's for the New Testament. Use Strong's, that's fine. Start there, that's fine. Then I just sort of read, are there a few words in here which really seem interesting, and I want to make sure I have them defined? Well, there are. So where would I start with a character study? Well, how about I define their names? So for example, in verse 2, what I do is I read, and Paul found a certain Jew named Aquila. Now in my margin, I'll write the word Aquila, or some sort of short form, depends what you want, AQU or something, equals eagle. So that's what Aquila's name means, and I find that out by looking on my lexicon. So Aquila, his name means an eagle. So I'll write that in my margin. So you're more than welcome to write that in your margin. That's what Aquila's name means. And then I'll sit there for a second, I'll think, okay, his name means an eagle. So you think, is it because the Roman sign was an eagle? Probably not. Was it maybe after one of the standards in the Old Testament, the eagle? Maybe. What I like to do is I like to just think, what's the characteristic of an eagle? Well, they soar high in the air. They're heavenly. They have foresight. They can see. So I kind of put that in my mind, like maybe these are the qualities that Aquila possessed. It's sort of a spiritual, lofty mind. Maybe he could see, he was very prudent. He could see ahead. That's all I just put in my mind. Okay. Then I look at Priscilla. So in verse 2, and he was come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Now Priscilla's got a very funny definition, okay, and it really throws you for a moment. But her name means, and so you write this in your margin, Priscilla equals little ancient. Little ancient. You think Priscilla's such a beautiful name. You can make a case that Priscilla's one of the most beautiful names you can name your daughter. And just FYI, I'm married to a Priscilla, so I'm a bit biased. But you think, little ancient, what does that mean? Was she small? Was she old? What does that mean? So when I wrote that in, I thought, okay, little ancient. And you think, okay, little. Maybe she's humble. Ancient. Maybe she's wise. And that's it. That's all I think. And I don't get dogmatic on that. I just say, okay, that's sort of, I've set that up in my own mind. Maybe she's humble, maybe she's wise. Now when I read the rest of her story, is that true? It might be completely opposite. So I just sort of start with something. Now we got a couple of definitions in our margin. So here's another one. So in verse 3, and because Paul was of the same craft, he abode with them and he wrought, for by their occupation, they were tent makers. Now, I don't mind doing this. So a tent maker, I mean, do you really need to look up the definition of a tent maker? And you really don't. But when you do, you don't necessarily sort of have this epiphany moment on what the definition means, because I mean, they're just making tents. But what you find is it doesn't occur anywhere else. So that's useful. So in your study, what I would say is next to verse 3 on tent makers, you don't necessarily need to write the definition, but you say it's the only occurrence in the New Testament. So that tells me that if we were being fair and honest, if you said, okay, how many tent makers are in the New Testament that we know of? Well, there's only 3. There's Paul, there's Aquila, and his wife. So that sort of helps to sort of bring like a finite focus that these are going to be some special, there's going to be a special connection between these 3 individuals. They're the only 3 in the New Testament that we know about. Now I'll give you sort of one more definition, okay? And in verse 4, it says that Paul reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. He's very consistent. And he persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. Now, here's what the word persuaded means in verse 4. So I'm trying to write this in. So verse 4, persuaded, it means to convince using evidence. So when Paul was persuading the Jews and the Greeks in verse 4, it means that he was attempting to convince them of who Jesus was, what the truth was, but he was using evidence. So now we have this excellent example of like how we should go about our conversations when we're talking to individuals. So just with this little study on Aquila and Priscilla, so far we have an ego, some themes about what an ego represents. Little ancient, some themes about maybe humility or wisdom. Okay, tent makers, there's only 3 of them in the New Testament. And then the tactic that Paul is using and that Aquila and Priscilla are being witness to, because we assume that they went to the synagogue, is that Paul would convince with evidence. Everything he said, he would sort of validate with the scriptures, we presume. So just to recap, I search Aquila and Priscilla, come to Acts 18. I try and appreciate the key narration, the key words, and the key definitions. Now I'll go through what I've just taken you through, youth conference, the rest of the way, and then I'll turn up the other occurrences where Aquila and Priscilla are found, okay? And they're in Romans 16, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Timothy 4. But they're almost like a passing comment, really, when you look at where they're mentioned. So I kind of like find my home base in the study of Aquila and Priscilla here in Acts 18, and you try and get a sense, okay? So once I've read, do some more marking, read, then once in a while, if I find like this chapter seems like it really needs some emotion, then I'll throw on maybe a Max McLean or an Alexander Scorby, and I'll try and get a sense. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe it is a somber chapter, or maybe they have sort of a way of reading it that I'm just sort of not picking up on. So if you're a very auditory learner, that would be maybe helpful for you. So once I've gleaned what God has to say on the characters, then I glean what others have to say on the characters. So we always start with God, and then I go to others, okay? So we've done God, as it were. So then I go to others. So this is where the books come in, okay? So you read Aquila and Priscilla, all right? And in Guidebook to the New Testament, he has them here, lovely section, covers all the sort of the high level points and some things. Ooh, that's really fascinating. So I read Guidebook to the New Testament, okay, on the New Testament characters. And as I mentioned in the interview, I really enjoy Merrill Unger's Bible Dictionary, because he gives a good sort of circle of where to find these characters and like where their vicissitudes are. It sort of gives you a good, idea of like what you're really biting off when you sort of look at this character study. So I go to those. I have a few others, and this is Bible People and Places. This is by Nelson's. It's just a quick little thing. That's it. And what I like about this is it sort of gives you where the characters are found too. So I use that. This is a chapter by chapter Bible commentary, and it's sort of like half pagers, 1 page commentary, the whole chapter. So if you really come to the chapter, you think, "Oh, I have no idea what's going on here." Then I sort of get a more fuller picture on the chapter there. Okay. Now, because it's Aquila and Priscilla, I pulled this off my shelf. This is Man and Women by Michael Lewis, a study of biblical roles. And he mentions Aquila and Priscilla, so I'll read what he has to say on that. Because they were tent makers, you think, in the Old Testament, who else was a tent maker? I'm not going to give you the answer, but you think about it. And he, had a hand in building the tabernacle. So I read something about him on the tabernacle, because I want to talk about, in my own mind, what our tent maker is all about. So I picked up that. Now, in Isaiah, there's a chapter, Isaiah, that deals with enlarging a tent. Okay, and it's in Isaiah 54. So if they're tent makers, you got to think, they're building physical tents, but maybe they're building spiritual tents, which is really what Isaiah 54 is about. So I picked up the ministry of the prophecies or prophets, Isaiah. This is Robert Roberts. He fell asleep while I was compiling, so C.C. Walker finished it off. Okay, so I pick up that, and I only just read the pertinent section. I don't read the whole thing. Then I have some commentators. And you have to be really careful with commentators. You have to choose them wisely. Not all commentators are good. You find a commentator that has the full Bible in different volumes. That's a good sign, okay? Because it's going to give you some depth. I like Warren W. Wiersbe because he goes verse by verse. And our community is very rare when we put together some books, especially our green expositors, verse by verse. What's that? Well, it's really helpful to have verse by verse, because if you come to a verse and you don't know what's going on, you really want that commentator to sort of give you a little insight. So I have that. Another pulpit commentary, there's something there I'll read. And then I have another commentary, another commentary, another commentary. And I'll just see what they have to say. Now, because I've already gleaned what God has to say, I have a good idea of what's going on. But then there might be some other details which I don't know. Right? I'll give you one. In verse 12, there's this character of Acts 18. His name is Gallio, and he was the deputy of Achaia. Well, I don't know when he was the deputy of Achaia. Well, in one of the commentators, they said that he reigned, or he was a deputy from AD 50 to AD 52. Great. Now I know when Acts 18 is taking place. Now, all these books are fantastic, and they are valuable and helpful. Now, when I was coming to the truth, when I was 19, these are the only 2 books I owned. These 2. It was my NIV Bible, and I had a commentator for the whole Bible. It's like that thick. And I was 19. So I would read, and I had this commentator. So if this is you at home, and you just have one Bible and one commentator, then that's fine. And that's where I started. And then because I just make bad decisions when it comes to buying books, I just buy a lot of books. And then I just read them. Now, once I've gleaned what God has to say, I've gleaned what others have to say, then I glean what I have to say. Okay? So I start with this. This is an 8.5 by 11, right out of the printer, nothing fancy, and a pen. And then I just write down what I think I've gleaned from all that study on the character. And then I come up with something like this. So I just have notes on Aquila and Priscilla, where they're found, maybe some ideas of who they are, etc., etc. And then I've got my study on these characters. So what I've done, conference, I've sort of taken you through just the 3-step process that I go through on a character study. I glean what God has to say on the characters, and that's where I'm looking for key narration, key words, and key definitions. Once I've done that over and over and over again, then I glean what others have to say on these characters. And some I say, yeah, that's a very good point. I agree with that. Some say, I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't see how they can prove that. And then the last thing I do is I glean what I have to say on that. And that's when I write it down on the white piece of paper. And that's all I do. Now, as I said in the interview, the goal of doing a character study, my personal goal, is I want to come away from doing the character study. So once I really have put it all down, either in my margins, which I just took you through, or on the paper, which is sort of the broader notes, I come away and I say, if I met this character or these characters, Aquila and Priscilla, in the kingdom, could I speak to them? Could I go up to them and ask them questions? Could I say, well, why was it that you were a tent maker? How was Paul when you first met him? What was it about Paul's convincing that sort of led you to either be more strengthened in your faith if you're already in the truth, or if you weren't, what caused you to say, whoa, the truth, this is the truth? So if I can come away from a character study like Aquila and Priscilla, and I believe that I can speak to them when, God willing, I meet them in the kingdom, and then I get a sense that I've met my goal. Then you move on to the next character study. These are real people. God willing, they're going to be in the kingdom. They're going to stand the resurrection with us. And they'll give account of their lives, we'll give account of ours. And God willing, we'll be in the kingdom together, and we'll help to usher in a time of great glory. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is what I've done just now, taking you through a very practical way to do a study in the comforts of your own home. And that way we can fill our minds with who these characters are. But God willing, when I meet Aquila and Priscilla, I want to ask them one question. And if you would like to know what that question is, you'll have to tune in this coming Wednesday, the Book Road Wednesday Bible class at 7:30 p.m. when, God willing, I'll give all the fruit of this study in a class on Aquila and Priscilla.